Welcome to Conversations with Bnai Brith International. I'm your host, CEO Dan Mariaschin. We appreciate your spending some time with us today. Joining me for the latest installment of our expert analysis series is Cheryl Kempler, Bnai Brith archivist and staff writer. We'll explore Bnai Brith's thriving presence in pre-World War II Europe and how the organization evolved during that period. And we'll focus today on three places: Germany, Austria, and Denmark. Cheryl, welcome back to the program.
Great to be here, Dan.
So before we begin the discussion about the three countries and Bnai Brith, give us a picture of what the Bnai Brith world looked like in 1933 when Hitler came to power.
Well, we had an extensive reach throughout Europe, Asia, and even Africa. We were a lifeline with thousands and thousands of members who provided great philanthropic benefits and services to people of all faiths throughout the continents. And we were an essential presence. It turns out, we were almost like the hidden history of what was going on in Europe in the 19th and 20th century. We were very much a part of it.
But we were in a lot of places that normally wouldn't come to mind. We were in Asia, Middle East. Tell us about that.
Well, we had our own district in the Middle East, and that was started from 1887 when we had lodges in Egypt, but by 1911 we had enough lodges in Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Turkey, and Syria to make our own district. And think about these countries at the time. They were really rudimentary and great deal of poverty, no real support networks. We set that all up. We helped people get employment. We fed people during natural disasters. When the war came, we set up soup kitchens and medical clinics. We were really considered the prime Jewish philanthropy there at the time.
And really up to 1948, we were also in the Middle East, in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt.
More than one lodge in each country, definitely.
So from 1882 to 1943, for almost 60 years, Bnai Brith in Europe continued to grow with new lodges and districts established in many countries, as you said. Despite wars, natural disasters, and a worldwide depression, its philanthropic efforts also expanded as lodges took on new problems and seemingly accomplished the impossible. How widespread was Bnai Brith in Europe at its height, both in terms of numbers and its impact?
Well, I can tell you this, that in Germany at its height, we had over 100 lodges with 15,000 members alone. In the countries of Asia, we had mostly over 1,000 members in each country, some even more. And in places where things were more remote, say Shanghai, we also had a very strong presence with a lot of members. So these men were able, those who could afford it, were able to fund projects. But all the time behind us were the funds of the American lodges as well.
Although our Bnai Brith archive is very rich in documents, letters and telegrams, minutes, there's relatively little photographic evidence. Why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it goes along with the invention of print media and the visuals at the time. Everything was very expensive in the 19th century. If you're going to print an image, it cost a lot of money. So it's not until the 1920s that photography really makes its appearance in periodicals, magazines, newspapers. Before that, there were a lot of drawings. But, there was another reason, I think, as well, when you're looking at the lodges newsletters from Europe. They're very copiously printed, speeches, minutes, everything like that. But I think these men were also modest. They didn't want to use images as marketing to tout their own horn. They wanted to do things quietly.
Let's talk about Bnai Brith's presence in Germany. What was the impetus behind the formation of Bnai Brith in Germany, and how did that actually happen? Now, just to go back in history a little bit, of course, we were founded in 1843, founded by German Jewish immigrants, but that was in 1843. When was the first lodge established in Germany, and how do you think that happened?
Well, you have to go back to the year that the Jews were emancipated in Germany, 1871. And from then on, they had all the rights of citizens, of all German citizens. And many of these men, even before that year, were Masons. That's how they achieved their philanthropic aims, by being Masons. This was true in the United States as well. Our leaders were mostly always Masons. Simon Wolf, for example, Krauss, they were all belonged to that organization. But even after a few years of German emancipation, things started to go backwards, and the men experienced discrimination in the Masonic lodges. So they wanted to form their own organization where they did not feel they could be ejected or experience prejudice. That's what was the big impetus behind the 1882, when the first German lodge was established in Berlin.
How fast did it grow across the country? Because you said there were ultimately, by 1933, 100 lodges. So that would suggest that almost every city or town with a Jewish population of any size would have had a Bnai Brith lodge.
Well, that is actually true. You know, all the big cities had a large German population. So people think, well, the first lodges were started in Berlin. Well, yes, they were for the main part, but the second lodge was started in Halle. So this kind of need was prevalent. It was everywhere. And so by 1890, we had about 33, 34 lodges in Germany alone.
And how many members are we? Who were the members? How many do you think there might have been? And from where did we draw our membership?
Well, historians say most of our members were merchants, but you know something? I'm finding from reading the primary source documents that may be true, but we also had many other men who were members of the organizations. Academics, for example, professors of philosophy, humanities professors, rabbis. We had people who were composers, musicians, and certainly lawyers and physicians.
Well, this is a picture of one of the German newsletters, German Bnai Brith newsletters. What kind of information did it contain?
Well, that's a very unusual newsletter. Our regular newsletters were all you could see for a visual was our Gothic masthead. But every year, a special edition was printed, and that edition was devoted to German artists who were members of the lodges. And as you can see the cover, the artist H.M. Lillian, and he was a most important Jewish Art Nouveau artist. He did many beautiful works, and he was kind of the personifier, the visual personifier of Herzl. And this, of course, was so that was his motif in the magazine. There were other special magazines. One was devoted to children's literature. That's the kind of humanities-oriented subjects which were published in the newsletter.
Now, from examining these primary documents and reading the detailed newsletters, what do you think were the one or two most important challenges or issues that the lodges in Germany attempted to alleviate?
Well, you know, reading these materials gives you a rare insight as to the way Europe was in the 19th century. And you can read novelists like Charles Dickens and see about poverty the way he portrayed it. But these newsletters give you the real information on what was going on. And from what I can see, the biggest problem in Europe was the fact that young people would get married, they would have a lot of progeny, meaning 4 or 5, and then given the mortality rates and also things like wars and natural catastrophes, these people would die or become impoverished. So they would leave their children, or worse, they would abandon their children out of necessity. So Europe at that time, and for years to come, was suffering from a dearth of facilities that cared for these kids. They usually were roaming the streets until they died, and Bnai Brith, this was one of their missions were education and spirituality and idealism, but what they had to do first was create these orphanages, and then they had to create special orphanages for, say, children who were blind or tubercular, facilities for kids who were malnourished, and that was another problem. These kids might have had parents, but particularly the city kids, they didn't have enough to eat. And this was causing terrible mortality among younger people. And that's what I think Bnai Brith, if you look at their list of accomplishments, that's what they did best. And that's what they did that was most prevalent.
You mentioned war. There were many Jews who fought on the German side, actually, in World War One. In any of these newsletters, are there reports from the front? Are there reports about veterans coming back?
This was very much something that the German lodges were very strong in. I think so much that the members and their leaders wanted to show, they wanted to reveal that they were patriots. So they kept a careful count on how many members and how many sons of members were soldiers. They also kept a count of how many fell in battle, people that won medals in battle, and they did everything they could to help the German government. They floated loans to the German government. They floated loans to the Red Cross. Even when the Red Cross ran out of money, they floated more loans. And then they encouraged their members to make personal loans to the government. And one of the things that Bnai Brith did, of course, this was not really reported after 1917. When we entered the war, there was a blackout on news in the American newsletters until 1919. But in 1915, the German lodges got together with the Red Cross and they created a hospital train. And this went all across the Russian regions on the borders, and they picked up soldiers who were wounded, not just Jewish soldiers, not that I believe not, all soldiers of all faiths. And the train was staffed, all the physicians had to be Bnai Brith members, and all the nurses were graduates of the Berlin Bnai Brith Academy of Nursing, which was a big deal. We had a lot of nursing schools in the country. So they were very much on top of this. And that was all the more tragic when in 1919, these books and articles started to appear that said the Jews were responsible for the war loss and we were in world domination. In fact, the Bnai Brith sued not once but twice editors who were writing these scurrilous things in their magazines. And guess what? We took them to court and we won. And they had to submit public apologies about what they had written.
Of course, that's the great irony, because less than 15 years later, the fortunes were completely reversed, of course, and the persecution of Jews in Germany and then ultimately elsewhere began. This is a picture of the farm school at Alem. Would you describe for us its origin? What was its purpose?
Well, one of the things that the lodges, and in fact lodges all around the world, was they wanted to restore and create jobs that were more manually oriented for Jews. There were so many in cerebral professions, and there were often quotas about this. So they wanted to teach Jewish men and women how to do things like farming, because people like Baron de Hirsch, they had colonies all over the world that were farm colonies that they set aside for Jews. And of course, Palestine. This was where they were needed the most. So in the Hanover Lodge, there was a very rich member, Moritz Simon. He was an American. He was the American consul in Hanover, and he put aside his own money, and then he went partners with the lodge. He needed people to collaborate with him, and he set up this farm school in Alem. It was a great big estate, which were donated to the lodge, and there people could come, people not from Germany, also Russia, and all over Europe could come, and they could learn fruit tree cultivation, farming, garden design, and there were hundreds of pupils, and many of them went on to do really good work in pre-state Israel, and also after 1948. They had a significant impact on farming methods and also things like parks and gardens there.
Well, this is a picture of the boarding school in Belitz. What kind of school was it? And can you tell us why it's important to understanding Bnai Brith's history?
Well, we always did innovative things, and this was probably only school in Germany, or maybe even in Europe, that took children who might normally have been institutionalized. Their IQ was low, or they had physical disability, and attempted to train them not just in things like the mundane activities of everyday life, but the educator who was head of the place, he wanted them to learn many other things. He taught them language skills, math, all sorts of things. And the student body, the range of age was 6 years old to 24 years old. And many graduates went on to lead normal or let's say fulfilling lives.
Well, you've talked about the philanthropic efforts of the Bnai Brith lodges, and of course this was true across the board around the world. Now, we have just a partial list of charities and causes supported or initiated by what was District 8. This is clearly, though, an incomplete record of the charities and the causes established. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, these places were sometimes established by the lodges and sometimes supported. And you can see from this list that there were not only hospitals, schools, homes for unwed mothers and places where mothers could get taught how to take care of their babies, but there were also organizations that helped with Palestine as well. The Bnai Brith itself was not a Zionist organization in Germany, but they were not unfriendly towards other Zionist organizations. And many of the members, and of course more and more as the decades went by, wanted to do something in Palestine for the Jews who were living there. So yes, in fact, if I wanted to compile a complete list, it would take many more pages. This alone is, you can see, very copious.
Let's go back to World War I again. How did the Bnai Brith lodges in Germany respond after war was declared in 1914? We talked a little about it in terms of the veterans or those who fought, and then we'll talk about what happened after Hitler came to power in 1933.
Well, you know, there's a lot of evidence, even today, of how the soldiers were fighting in Germany. Somehow, the Nazis leapt up most of the honorary graveyards that are devoted just to Jewish heroes of World War I. And anyone who's interested can look at a number of books that are still available that shows the lists and lists of men who went to the front and who did more than their share. Many of them won medals. Many of them many of them were killed. But by 1918, the lodges could justly be proud of the record of military service between themselves and their sons.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention it because I had the opportunity shortly after the reunification of Germany to visit Dresden, and in front of the synagogue, Jewish community building there, there was a monument with the names of Jewish soldiers from Dresden, fought in World War I, who fell in battle. And I'm sure that was done probably quite not too long before we arrived there, because things had been cleaned up and spruced up a bit. But this was probably true in many cities where there were these monuments.
Yes, and what's interesting is why so many were let alone by the Nazis. They did not desecrate these cemeteries, and they're very interesting to tour. In fact, if you go on our Jewish Heritage newsletter website, you'll see a tour of these cemeteries.
What happened after Hitler came to power? Bnai Brith, more than 100 lodges all over the country, a very prominent organization in the Jewish community. It was a well-organized Jewish community in Germany. What happened to Bnai Brith?
Well, we were Hitler's special target because we had American connections and because we did so much. So by March 1933, things were already being set in motion about the oppression of the Jewish people in Germany. And there were many lodge members outside of Germany that tried to help our lodge members. And they were in a contact with our leader there, Rabbi Leo Beck, and they tried to gauge the situation of what was happening there to our members. And there are incidents that were recorded, especially for things that had happened especially to our lodge members. In Nuremberg, for example, in May 1933, the Nazis came and they rounded up all the Bnai Brith leaders and they put them into there was a big sports stadium there, and they took the men, mostly older men, and they made them crawl on the ground, and then they put them in prison, and then they let them out just to kind of give them a sort of a taste of brutality. So we knew that our members were in jeopardy, and any protests on our part in the United States might put our members in even more jeopardy as well. So although our lodges really for years to come continued to help the Jews whose professions were taken away from them and who seemed to organize Jewish activities to make life better for them, that was certainly something our lodges did as well.
Those German Jewish refugees who were able to get out in the 1930s, many of them came to New York, came to other cities. Did these folks join up with our lodges in the United States? Do we have examples of that?
They did join up with their lodges, but also they might have created, particularly in New York City, their own lodges for people who had left. And of course, there is a lodge that was organized by the Austrian community, the Leo Beck Lodge, and there was a Czechoslovakian lodge as well in New York as well, I think Liberty Lodge. So yes, they did tend to stay together, but they also wanted to merge with other lodges as well. And they were the ones after the war, they were the ones who were the expert in helping us send food over to the displaced persons camp. They knew how to get around and how to do things most efficiently.
Yeah, well, this was, I know, going back to the situation in 1933, and as it got worse and worse, I know it became a conundrum for the leadership of Bnai Brith in terms of whether to speak out or not speak out of concern, as you said, for the welfare of those in Germany, that it could get worse. And of course, it not only got worse, it just became the tragedy, the great tragedy that we know occurred. Are there people who've written about that? Did they write about it later? I mean, meaning our leaders at the time of this dilemma that they experienced?
Well, I think the real story, there were reports made, but not by us. But the real story is contained in our archival documents. It's a poignant record of what happened, our continued efforts to meet behind the scenes with the State Department, people like Cordell Hull saying they would monitor the situation, the increasing frustration and incredible sadness of our leaders who slowly came to the realization that there wasn't much that could be done to help our people there without putting them in jeopardy, and also without the cooperation of the State Department, which clearly was not there. And in Europe as well, people began to realize this. In England, where they tried to make a real protest, they realized this was the wrong thing to do. And so in the end, things had to be done in secret. And whatever we could do, we did, but it was a losing battle, let's put it that way.
Before we move on to Austria, you mentioned Rabbi Leo Beck. Tell us about Leo Beck and what happened to him.
Well, Leo Beck was our Grand Lodge leader from 1923 on to 1937 when the lodges were closed. And he was a rabbi who fused rational thinking and contemporary Judeo-Christian philosophy with Jewish theology. He was adulated by our members. And he was, even before Hitler came to power, he was the recognized leader and expert on Jewish affairs, and he was consulted by the government. And when Hitler came to power, that did not end. He was the conduit between the Nazis and the Jewish people. And he was offered many times. He was a very eminent man. In fact, he left Germany several times, and he could have just stayed away, but he chose to go back to be with not only members of Bnai Brith, but his congregation as well. And in the end, he was he refused a pulpit here in the United States, could have gotten him out. In the end, he was sent to Theresienstadt, where where people who were inmates said he was a great solace and comfort to them. And the interesting thing is, the day before his execution was scheduled was the day that the camp was liberated. And he was, the inmates, they wanted to kill the guards, and he stopped them from doing that. So he was a humanitarian. He lived it and he thought it. And afterwards he settled in England, but he made several trips to the United States, where he continued to be active in reviving the lodges of Europe.
Well, let's talk about Bnai Brith in Austria. When were the first Austrian lodges established?
Well, Austria was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So at first, from about 1889 through 1918, there was one big district, District 10, and that included the lodges of what is today Austria, today Poland, and today Czechoslovakia. And so this was one big, just a big conglomerate. But once the war occurred, we here in the United States, we sent our leader over to tour the lodges, and he said, it's necessary to create new districts for each country. So in 1919, the lodges of Austria were formed. That's District 12. And originally, there were only 2 lodges in District 12, 2 lodges in Vienna. But by 1930, there were 6 lodges, 4 lodges in Vienna, 1 in Graz, and 1 in Linz. And they also did amazing work as well, particularly as much as they were involved in philanthropic activity, they were very much devoted, being Viennese, to the arts, the music and the visual arts and the theater.
I know that many prominent individuals joined Bnai Brith in Austria. Tell us about Sigmund Freud's involvement in the Vienna Lodge.
Yes, Sigmund Freud was a member of the Vienna Lodge. He joined in 1897. The lodge was 2 years old then, and most of the members were colleagues of his and his own physicians. They were pulmonologists, cardiologists, psychologists, psychiatrists. And he, of course, Vienna was a very anti-Semitic place. And even though Jews had become prominent in all professions, because the people who were titled and have the money, they were rather indolent. So it was the Jews who became sort of on top of things. And so he himself faced, when he tried to perpetuate his lectures, speak in front of his own medical colleagues, they most of the time denigrated. So here he had a place where he felt secure and non-threatened, and he could talk about his own theories with the members. And at that, in 1897, when he joined, he was deeply involved in the dream theory analysis. And according to him, he kind of tested out his theories on the members, and he said the members were always tolerant and always listened and were greatly interested in what he said. But the thing about the Vienna Lodge is that all members had to lecture, and they didn't just lecture on their own professions. That also marked our members. They were involved in business and industry and medicine, but they were all, some had written books on Jewish history, some who were involved in music. So he himself gave another lecture, I saw in the Lodge book, on the novels of Émile Zola. So he had, as you know, Freud was interested in archaeology, in literature. He got a chance to reveal that to the members as well.
No, it's interesting. Of course, the Nazis just gathered up troves of documents, including thousands and thousands of documents of Bnai Brith in Germany and Austria. And ultimately, the Red Army gathered them as they were defeating the Nazis and brought a lot of that back to Moscow. And in the early 90s, I believe, when people were going through the archives in Moscow, they came up with many of our documents. And a colleague of mine at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum was very interested because the museum had gone over to view and ultimately to make copies of many of these documents. And he was hoping that he would find a lecture by Freud that may have been given that had never been published. Well, they didn't find it, but that only backs up what you've just said about if you were a member of that lodge, you had to be prepared to give a lecture. This is, it shows, I think, a very interesting side of, when we think of Vienna, we think of culture, and certainly having a roster of luminaries giving lectures, I think really says a lot about Bnai Brith at that time.
Well, if you get a chance to see some of our members in Vienna, they were real lights of the time. One of our, I think it's very interesting that one of our members was Felix Salten, the German expressionist novelist who wrote Bambi. And he was a friend of people like Arthur Schnitzler. He gave lectures too, usually on a silent film, the new movies that were coming out, because he was a theater and film critic himself. But if you read, say, his novel Bambi in the light of the own prejudice that he experienced, and probably his very difficult life, and yet he got to the top, you see the story that he portrays in a whole different light. It's a very tragic book, and it's a very tragic allegory.
Well, this is a rare photo of the renovated lodge facilities in Graz. Are there any other surviving photos that show the Austrian lodges?
No, there aren't. And what's interesting about those lodge rooms, they took the pictures because they had been renovated. And where our German lodges, they had these big headquarters, mansions in every city. They had a huge headquarters with garden rooms and ballrooms and tea rooms. In contrast, the Viennese lodges, you can see very austere, nothing on the walls, very plain. But I like the fact that the furniture is the latest. It reflects the visual aesthetic of the Vienna Secession and all the new cutting edge artists and decorative artists that were involved in Vienna at the time.
Well, lastly, another lodge of note was located in Copenhagen, Denmark. The Jewish population of Denmark was small. When was that lodge established, and what needs did it address? The image we see is a copy of the frontispiece of a book about the Jews in Denmark. Tell us about that lodge.
Well, 1912, the Denmark Lodge was formed by members of the German Lodge. In fact, the same people who established the lodges in Asia went elsewhere to establish lodges. And Denmark was formed, and this was a time when many Russians were settling in Denmark, Russian Jews, and the numbers would only grow after 1914 with the beginning of World War I. They were anxious to get out of the country. And as you know, there was a very famous Copenhagen resident from Russia, and that was Sholem Aleichem. So the first thing that the lodges did there, there were only 800 Jews in Copenhagen. The entire population of Denmark that was Jewish was less than 6,000. So the lodge was, even at the beginning, 130 men joined the lodge, not to mention the women's auxiliary. So out of a population in Copenhagen of 800 people, 130 members were lodge members. People were lodge members. You can see that's a big proportion. And the first thing they did was they were true to what they wanted to do in terms of education. They started what was called the Toynbee Halls. And these were places where people could go and hear lectures, they could read books, they could get a little something to eat, they could hear concerts. And it was not just open to Jews, this was open to everybody. And this was something that also occurred in Germany and Austria as well. They also set up schools for Russian kids. They had libraries. They did have some charitable homes for older people. And of course, the difference between our members in Austria and Germany, they were all people who belonged to upper echelon professions. And that was largely true in Copenhagen as well. But the thing that was going on in Denmark that we didn't have in those other countries was this great silversmithing tradition. So many of our members in Copenhagen were silver designers, or they were administrators, and we have some interesting photographs of artifacts that are still extant from Copenhagen, bells made by some of the members for the Copenhagen Lodge, which was incidentally number 712.
And that lodge never stopped operating, even after the daring rescue of Denmark's Jewish population under the cover of night in 1943 when the Jews left for Sweden. Were lodge members among the people who were transported on those boats?
They were, and interestingly enough, some of them were captured and they were sent. A small proportion of the Jews who escaped were sent to Theresienstadt. But most of our 8 leaders who went to Theresienstadt, they were ransomed. The Germans asked for ransom, and we do know the person who paid their ransom, not a Jew, but the Count Bernadotte from Denmark. He paid their ransom. But most of the men who escaped on the boats, they were transported to Malmo, Sweden, where they continued to have lodge meetings. And I think we have on file, I think you'll see a telegram, not directly from the lodge members, but from our Washington executive secretary to our then Supreme Grand Lodge president, Henry Monsky, which says the members escaped, they're in Malmo, they're continuing to meet, but they escaped without any money at all. So they're going to need $15,000 to continue. And we have no record of the money being sent, but I'm sure if we didn't send 15, we sent 14, because we usually complied with what we needed to do. And after the war, they came back, and the first thing they did was they set up foster homes for kids who were traumatized by the Holocaust in Holland and elsewhere. They took these kids over and they gave them a normal life for a while to help them adjust back to make them fulfilled. I mean, to prevent psychological trauma.
That lodge is still very active. Of course, one of its longtime leaders, Rabbi Bent Melchior, who was the chief rabbi of Denmark, and the Melchior family, and many others. Well, Cheryl, this is really fascinating. We've just covered 3 countries. There are many more. We were all over the world. We hope that you will come back and we'll delve into some other aspects of the long history of Bnai Brith. And we really appreciate you taking the time with us today to be with us. Great to have you back on talking about our organization's history.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Well, thanks to Cheryl Kempler for joining me. Thank you for tuning in to this conversation with Bnai Brith. If you like what you've heard, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the Bnai Brith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our work. For my guest, Cheryl Kempler, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you again next time on Conversations with Bnai Brith International.